Hello and welcome to episode 49 of the Page One podcast. I'm Marco.
I'm Tariq.
And thanks for joining us at the Page One podcast, where we like to talk to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, their process, and try and get as many hints and tips as possible from them. We've had some great guests on. This is our 49th episode, as I said. We've almost made that half-century mark.
Almost. So close. Will we be able to last one?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, please do check out the past episodes. There's all sorts of writers, authors, screenwriters, journalists, video game writers, comic writers. So if you're interested in writing at all, then there should be someone there for you. And we've got a first this week, Tariq, because
we do.
Our guest is a writer, but also...
He's also a vice president, an executive managing editor, and a copy chief at Random House US.
Yes.
Very exciting. Mr. Benjamin Dreyer.
Mm-hmm.
He started off as a freelance proofreader and a copy editor, and he's worked his way up to become pretty much the top dog in the editing world over at Random House by the sounds of it.
Exactly. And it was interesting speaking to him because, you know, copy editor is something that maybe a lot of people have heard of, but they don't, you know, what's the difference between a copy editor, a production editor, and as Benjamin calls it, an editor. You know, so he doesn't really get involved, or a copy editor doesn't really get involved in structuring the story or anything like that. It's more looking at the actual words and the structure of the sentences, and does it flow, and is there an inadvertent rhyme? Is there a word that the author keeps using that could be changed, and things like that? So
yeah,
it's
that kind of guy comes in and polishes the prose to the real, you know, to it's shining until you can see your face in it. Exactly,
that's it. Yeah, it's not changing the author's voice. It's like trying to get the best version of the author's voice.
Exactly. Yeah.
But he's written recently Dreyer's English, which is a sort of style guide, but it's I would say it's a slightly unusual style guide because it's not like dry at all. It's very, pardon the pun on the name, but it's you know, it's very amusingly written, and because of that, you retain the information much more. And we talked to him about that process, how he went about writing that, and why he went about writing that, and also talked to him about a game that came off the back of Dreyer's English as well, called Stet, which sounds like a good party game. I definitely want to get a copy, and hear about his writing plans for the future as well.
And absolutely, yeah. And even if you're not into the minutiae of the editing world, I think there's a lot to get from this, and I think everybody will really enjoy it.
Yeah,
it's really fun chat.
It is fun, and he's a really entertaining guy. He's got good anecdotes as well. So, really hope you enjoy the episode. We will be back at the end of the episode with a bit more chat and to let you know about next week's guest for our 50th episode.
50th, the milestone.
But in the meantime, we'll leave you with a quick advert for our Page One Writer's Notebook, and then we'll get on with the podcast.
On with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just the story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project. divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page 1.
You are, in fact, we've had authors, screenwriters, video game writers, comics writers, all sorts of writers, but you're the first person that we've had from sort of behind the scenes, if you like, of the publishing industry. Now, did you grow up wanting to get into the publishing world, or did you grow up wanting to be a writer? How did you find that path into that industry?
I wandered into publishing absolutely accidentally. When I was a kid and growing up, I got it into my head that I wanted to be an actor.
Right.
And in pursuit of that, I went to Northwestern University in Illinois, which is one of the most renowned theater universities in the country. The problem was that I found out pretty early on that I was in classes with a lot of other students who were, to my view, vastly more talented than I was, and I could see that. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't sign on, at the age of 19 to be a mediocrity. Now, if I had had a better sense of, self-possession, I might have simply just redoubled my efforts and thought, well, I'm going to figure out how to do this. But I didn't have that. I just didn't have it in me. So I wandered away from it. I let it go. I spent a lot of my 20s very happily doing not much of anything at all because, after having, worked so hard to be educated, it was like I just felt like goofing off. So I goofed off a lot. And I did a lot of things. I mean, I did a lot of what people often do when they can't think of anything better to do, which was I waited on tables and I bartended. But there was a part of me that wanted to be a writer. Mm-hmm. And I did work for a while for one of the local papers in Chicago doing film and theater reviews, which I enjoyed hugely. Mm-hmm. I did try my hand at writing some fiction. What I found was that, again, it was how my brain was and was not wired. I began to find the process very difficult and very painful. Mm-hmm. And I recall a friend of mine saying to me, there's nothing worse than always being in a state of, I'm not writing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So once again, it was perhaps the right effort at the wrong time to get to the point. I had a friend who was a much published writer, and I remember asking him once if he thought there was something I could do in the publishing industry, since I knew nothing about the publishing industry, and he suggested to me that I might make a good proofreader because I have a good eye for that sort of thing. And he introduced me to his production editor, the production editor being, there are various terms for it in various companies, but to my mind, the production editor is the person in the publishing house who hires the copy editor, who hires the proofreaders, right, who squires the book through the whole process after the actual editing process is complete. In any event, she hired me to do proofreading. Sight unseen. It was a great leap on her part, but I took to it, I loved it, and I had a knack for it. Mm-hmm. And I started doing it, and I started doing it more. And as I was doing it, she was giving me great feedback, job after job after job, which was so valuable to me about the things that I didn't know. But I also realized that my whole approach to it, aside from having a good eye for a typo, was that I had a knack, that I had an ear, yeah, but I didn't have the names for any of the things I was supposed to know. I just sort of knew this would be better if it were something else.
Yeah.
So I really started to read the style manuals, to learn the details of grammar, which, to be perfectly honest, I had never really been taught. in school, because, like I said, if you're going to do a job like that, it's good that you know what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
The funny thing about it is that once you've studied all that stuff, once you've learned it, once you've begun to internalize it, you can go right back to forgetting what everything is called, because it's not the point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The point is to improve it, to improve writing. If you have the knowledge, great. If you know what these things are, great. But that's not what you're bringing to the job. You're going right back to bringing your ear with you.
So when you sit down and you were doing these test jobs and you were learning the craft and stuff, what was a typical day? What was the actual job? What kind of stuff were you having to do day by day?
Well, I started out as a proofreader, so I would be sitting in my apartment and working on page proofs that she would send me, or that I would go pick up from her. And so I would have, to the left, I had the manuscript, which had, all of the copy editing written on it and the author's responses to it. So that was really a huge part of my education, because that's where I saw what copy editing was. Yeah. What copy editors were asking and how authors responded to it. But what I was doing as the proofreader, to my right, I have the page proofs. And essentially, the job is look at the page proofs, look at the manuscript, and make sure that everything that's on the manuscript page has successfully made its way to the page proofs. Now, in those days, so this is like the early 1990s, very pre-digital era, manuscripts are probably being typed. Authors aren't really even much doing word processing, and those manuscripts are being Xeroxed, and then they are being sent to compositors to be keyboarded by hand. Wow. And so the thing is, you would have typos then, because the process was a matter of people reading other people's handwriting and trying to figure out what they were writing. So you would in those days have a lot more typos than we have now. I mean, nowadays when you go to page proofs, because you're working on a Word file that has been corrected and changes are put in and the whole thing's very clean, it's very hard to have a typographical error. All you really find yourself finding are things that have gone unnoticed.
Right.
Which happens because nobody could be everywhere all at once.
Yeah.
So I love doing it. I mean, it's really like just sort of it's problem solving. It's like doing a puzzle, 8 hours a day. But what was fascinating was to watch the copy editing conversation, to see the sorts of suggestions that copy editors were making, which was not simply, oh, you've misspelled this word, or I want to like fix your punctuation a little bit. It was, pointing out logistical problems, pointing out that an author had put what seemed to be an inadvertent rhyme, in a line, or authors. Authors all have pet words. I mean, authors each have their own pet words.
Yeah.
But it's like you keep hitting that word. You keep saying, it's like, this is the fifth relentlessly I have noticed in 5 pages. So that's what you're doing as a copy editor. The one thing it took me an awfully long time to learn, not an awfully long time, it took me a while to learn, is that I think when you get started, if you were me and you're maybe a little less than absolutely secure in your own gifts for this sort of work, you tend to get stricter than is strictly speaking necessary. So you're fixing and you're fussing. What you really have to learn, I think, if you really want to be a good copy editor, is to how to bring that great sense of improvement to the page, but also very much to listen to what the writer is trying to do before you decide that you're going to make it better. I always suggest to copy editors, try to read the first 30, 35, 40 pages of a manuscript with your hands by your side before you start changing.
That makes a lot of sense. I was going to ask about that, the sort of the relationship between the author and the copy editor. I mean, do authors respond differently? Different authors respond differently to suggestions that are made to them. Are some of them very, very stubborn in the suggestions that you're making to them?
I have found over the years that good writers tend to very much love to be well copy edited, and the well in that is very important. You know, writers love when a copy editor is paying so much attention to what they're doing. I mean, of course, what writer wouldn't like somebody who's reading their sentences down to the microscopic level? And good authors will respond appropriately. And it's not to say that every suggestion a copy editor makes is brilliant, and that, you know, and writers shouldn't always say yes. Writers should say no. It's their book, and I think that as a copy editor, I think my feelings would be hurt if the writer just said yeah. It's like I did all this work. You have to like care enough to say no every now and then. Yeah. But there are other writers who do not take kindly to being copy edited because they view it as an affront. They view it as a challenge. They view it as somebody saying your writing is not good.
Yeah, I can see
that. And they don't always respond well. I mean, it used to be, you know, it used to be, again, back in the days and shortly after I arrived at Random House, when I'm no longer a freelancer, but actually, you know, working in a department. I've become that production editor. I've become the person hiring the copy editors. Well, there would be days when one of us would get a manuscript back from an author, and we would all sit down and look, because again, we're still on paper in those days. Look at the response. Like, look at the growing fury, page by page by page, as the writer is increasingly not happy with what is going on. An absolute true story is that I remember being shown a manuscript in which the copy editor had made basically the same suggestion 20 times over the course of the manuscript. I mean, because it was the same mistake 20 times over the course of the manuscript. And the first time the author didn't like the change, the author crossed it out and wrote Stet. The second time the author saw the change, the author crossed it out and wrote Stet in all capital letters with an exclamation mark. And then the third time the author wrote in the margin, I said Stet. It's like as if we were there doing the job in real time.
Oh, and does it make a difference, you know, as a job, you're being, as a copy editor, you're being given by the production editor, it sounds like, the manuscript to work on of a specific author. You know, I'm just trying to imagine being in that role. If you're given a bad book or a bad manuscript or a good manuscript, how does that affect your job? Does it make your job harder, or do you actually quite like it because there's a lot to do, sort of a thing?
Yeah, it's hard working on a bad manuscript, and when I was a freelancer, and basically if you want to be an effective and hireable freelancer, you try to say yes every time somebody offers you a job. I mean, if you have the space in your schedule to do it, because you can't get too fussy, you can't get too picky. But I would find myself working on books sometimes that I thought were terrible. And it can be very frustrating for a copy editor. You're trying to do the best you can to do your job, to improve what is in fact on the page. The temptation to rewrite can be huge. I don't miss being a freelance copy editor, taking whatever jobs were being put in front of me. I remember once being given a job, and the word came down from the editor to the production editor to me that was basically, tell Benjamin to do whatever he wants. You know, the editor said, I've been through this 5 times, I can't stand it anymore. Tell him to do whatever he wants. So I rolled up my sleeves and I did whatever I wanted, and I rewrote sentences, and I changed things, and I did this, and I did that, and I didn't enjoy it even a little. And when it was all over, and I did finally see the finished book, and I remember leafing through it and thinking, you want to know what? It's still terrible, and and nothing I could do was ever going to make it be anything other than terrible. But I put blood into it, and I realized for no good reason.
Yeah.
And you begin to realize that you just simply need to respect your own boundaries, and to recognize that the manuscript is what the manuscript is. So you do the best you can, and then get on with it.
To that extent, do you have you ever, I suppose it was maybe when you were a freelancer, but do you ever get into that position of going, why am I even looking at this? Why did someone decide to say, let's go ahead with this?
Yeah, I mean, you know, to be perfectly honest, yes, you do. Uh-huh. And you know, some of the jobs that I did as a freelancer were for houses whose attitude toward publishing was, if we throw enough pasta at the wall, some of it's going to stick. Mm-hmm. So that's the way it would be. I am happy to say, and I no longer, except on extremely rare occasions, put my own hands on manuscripts. I mean, that's a process in my past, but I have a whole huge department of production editors, and we do talk about manuscripts that are troubled, and our product's pretty good. It's pretty good when we start with it. So it's the copy editors are very rarely frustrated with what they are working on. And I really have to say, I mean, it's not. I am in many ways a snob about a lot of things, but I'm not really a snob about writing. I like writing that's good. Mm-hmm. That's pretty much it. And I always like to remember that of the hundreds of books that I worked on when I was a freelancer, there's one that I don't know, it got under my skin in this way, because I so enjoyed working on it, and it was a Regency romance called Emily Goes to Exeter. And it was just, this lovely little story about this retired governess who gets in a stagecoach because she's never been anywhere, and maybe she's going to Exeter, and there are romantic entanglements and all these things going on. And it was just such a lovely, beautifully told story that I've carried this memory with me for decades of how much I loved this little Regency romance.
Brilliant.
And it sounds to me like, from what you're saying, that a copy editor's job kind of slots in amongst a whole lot of other people's job, because you've got the author, you've got the manuscript, and then you've got also, I presume, a story editor or an editor who's working on the overall plot. And that's not something I take a copy editor would ever have any say on, or on the whole larger structure of a story. It's really just the minutiae of the sentences, etc. Is that right?
I mean, that's exactly it. The book's actual editor, I always call those people the editors. They're the ones who contracted the book for the house. Yeah. And they've been working on it with the author for who knows how many years, drafts back and forth. I mean, they work on the really big ticket stuff, pace and story arc, and which characters need to be brought up a little bit and which characters need to be pushed back a little bit. I remember once having I was in the office of our publisher, editor-in-chief, Susan Campbell, one of the greatest. I mean, I've worked with a lot of really amazing editors. Susan was extraordinary, and I remember Susan describing to me problems she was having, work she was having on a particular manuscript, and the way she was describing to me what was going on and what she thought about it and how it needed to be fixed really very much made me realize the difference between what an editor does and what a copy editor does, because what she was describing to me was this sort of, I mean, it was like alchemy. Mm-hmm. And I was like, wow, that's what you do, huh? Because what I do as a copy editor, I mean, a copy editor's sense of big picture is making sure that the plot is logical from the beginning to the end, that the calendar doesn't go awry. It's not a copy editor's job to say, I don't like that character. or this seems too long. Copy editors work. I guess the best way is to think of it is editors work, big arcs, big picture. Although a lot of editors also really like getting into the nitty gritty of sentences.
Yeah.
But they also know that somebody's going to work on that later. Copy editors are working paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence. Rhythm, punctuation, pet words, inadvertent rhymes, that sort of thing. So it's very it's very like nitty gritty down to the nuclear details.
Yeah.
And you said you don't get involved in the actual copy editing very much anymore. So what is your day to day now? What are you doing now?
My day to day life now is that I wear two hats, and this is fairly standard in American publishing, that in any given group, the so-called managing editor and the so-called copy chief are going to be the same person.
Right.
So as managing editor, it's a matter of lots and lots of conversations with publishers, making sure that everything is staying on schedule, making sure that books that need to be done, as opposed to our standard 9 or 10 months books that for often very good reasons need to be done much faster, get done.
Mm-hmm.
You're right in the middle of everybody wanting information, whether they're in publicity or marketing. It's like, when is this? What is this? Where is this? And so you're doing a lot of that. And so you're changing on sale dates, you're changing prices, you're nagging editors where the manuscripts are. And of course, I have my staff of managing editors that work with me. I mean, it's a great big group. My group is the Random House group, which is part of Penguin Random House, which is massive. But there are other divisions that are none of my business. But my business is the Random House group. So as managing editor, basically it's to use what can be an unsavory metaphor given its 20th century history, you're making the trains run on time. As copy chief, my responsibility is in working with my production editors just to make sure that we are all doing our best jobs to make sure that the books are copy edited and proofread beautifully and brilliantly, so that the books that we publish are as close to perfect as is arguably possible to achieve. And some of it is the same stuff that I've been doing for decades, making sure that everybody's paying attention. But a lot of it lately has been, the evolution of language and how we're dealing with changes in style, changes in the way people write, how they express themselves, and keeping up with that. It's a danger in a copy editor to be too hidebound, to be too like, this is the way it's done.
Yeah.
It's like you gotta pay attention to to how things are changing.
Yeah, and that must be quite a difficult thing, because we've all read books where the vernacular or the style of it is so crazy. Either maybe it's a sci-fi book or it's something like it's just written in a really colloquial local style, and is that and I can see the temptation there to kind of flatten that out or normalize it a little bit. And how do you know how much to lean into that, how much to pull back to keep it readable? And is that quite hard?
It is really a matter of in that preliminary read when you're not touching the manuscript, like, okay, this is what the author is doing.
Yeah.
If a manuscript is written in a fairly sort of standard nonfiction journalistic kind of style, well, it's like, okay, that's the cap I'm going to put on when I'm working on that manuscript. As you start sort of leaning to the left and you're working on fiction and it's getting odder and more eccentric, well, it's like, okay, what's going on here and how am I going to support it? Mm-hmm. The copy editor who ultimately copy edited my book is a great favorite among authors, because she's so good at listening to what they are doing. And one of the authors who's particularly keen on her is George Saunders, right. Which if you've read George, you know that he has his very fascinating ear and eye and hand and what is on the page is going to be unusual. And their point of getting to love each other was when George wrote this story called Fox 8, which is narrated by a fox. It's narrated by a fox who has learned English by listening at the windows of people's houses. and what he hears then sort of goes into his brain and comes out in how he thinks things are spelled or what words are. I mean, for instance, he thinks that there's a verb called he goes, which of course is attached to dialogue,
yeah.
Blah, 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 he goes. And so Bonnie worked on that. And of course she wasn't gonna flatten it out, like you said, which is the great danger of copy editors, like not getting jokes and then flattening them out. Yeah. But she was like in there and it was like, okay, this is a little inconsistent. This is maybe not clear in a way I don't think you intend. Mm-hmm. But working within the context of what he had done to just make it even more effective than it was. Well, they fell in love with each other, so they just keep working together all the time.
I mean, so it's sort of like it sounds like it's almost like fine-tuning the author's voice, the writer's voice, rather than imposing a sort of house style or something on it. It's more, what is this voice and how can I make it sound as best as possible, basically.
I mean, exactly. And one of the things that, that I remember being taught when I arrived at Random House, and it's a sort of a theme that we carry on, is that Random House doesn't have a house style. Mm. I mean, aside from doing the same things that everybody does, setting movies in italics and songs in, Roman and quotation marks and observing rudimentary rules of how things get, printed, every book needs to be approached on its own terms. So yeah, I mean that's what we that's what we do. That's how we try to do it, not to impose on an author something that is unnatural.
Yeah.
But again, the other part of it, the balancing act, is that one of the things you want to do as a copy editor is you're protecting the author, and if an author is, if an author is going to do something that's peculiar or unusual, and you as the copy editor think, A, this isn't really as effective as you might think it is, B, maybe you're not even aware that you're doing something that's eccentric, or is generally considered to be non-standard, and then also it's like, if we can fix this now, then you're not going to get called out in public after the fact for not being a good writer. I mean, as I always like to say, if a writer wants to irritate readers, do it for a good reason and do it on purpose.
Yeah. That's a good approach, I think.
I like that. Yeah.
And I think recently, I understand it was a few years ago, you decided to go back to writing. Is that right? You decided to give that another try, which of course led to Dreyer's English. Do you want to tell us a bit about how that came about then?
Yeah, that came about. In fact, and this is as I've been realizing lately, most of my really good stories lately seem to involve my colleague Susan Campbell, who died last year.
Oh.
We lost a lot. I mean, Susan was on the young side, and it was a great loss. But she was really important to me on every possible level. So the story then is that Susan calls me one afternoon and says, we're publishing Elizabeth Strout's next novel. And I was like, well, of course, I'm the managing editor. I would know that. And she said, Liz asked me if I would ask you if you would copy edit the manuscript. And Susan says that she told Liz, well, Benjamin doesn't really do that anymore. But she said, but I'll ask him. And so she asked me, and I was like, yeah, I think I can find time to copy edit one of my favorite writers. I mean, Elizabeth Strout, the author of Olive Kittredge, which was just spectacular. The spectacular book. Anyway, so I did copy copy edit it. And in the process of copy editing it, and Liz is now the only writer I copy edit. And we've done now, I think we're on our 5th book. So I get to keep my hand in it. But in copy editing the Burgess Boys, I reconnected with the joy that I had forgotten about how much I like to copy edit, which then led me to thinking, oh, maybe I want to write a book about copy editing. And then once again, there I am, barging into Susan Campbell's office and saying, Susan, I think I want to write a book. And so she encouraged me, and that's how this happened.
And it's a really useful book, as a writer, but also it's written in it has that unique voice. It has a very humorous tone throughout the whole book, but it's so much easier to take things on board when it's delivered in that way than some sort of dry style guide. So I mean, I take it that was always the intention, was to have a bit of fun with it as well.
It was always the intention, though. It was not always showing up in the execution. And for the first 1.5 years, 2 years I was working on the book, I was writing a lot of stuff that was really sort of dry, and even I was bored with it, looking at it, and I was like, this just isn't working. And finally I realized what was called for, and it was really about trying to write something that was, I mean, I make a lot of jokes, or at least half jokes in the book, about don't do this, don't do that, don't ever do that. But I like to think that I do it with at least enough of a wink so that the reader gets that I'm deadly serious and joking at the same time.
Yeah.
But as many times as I possibly could, I do try to phrase things in this is what you can do, should do, might do, to state things in the affirmative rather than in the negative. And if I am going to make a joke that's about never doing this, never doing that, I want the reader to feel that the reader's in on the joke with me.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I wanted it to be a happy, friendly book, not 256 pages of finger wagging.
Yes.
Who needs that?
And what was the process like for you when you were writing this book? Because obviously you'd done some writing at the start of your jobs, and then you went into this other path, and then you kind of went back to it again. And did you feel more confident kind of second time around because you were writing about stuff you knew more about?
It after a while, there was the great like click in my brain when it finally happened. But I remember when I started writing that all of my friends who were writers were saying to me, in the nicest, most loving possible way, you are going to go through every crisis that writers go through. All the I have no talent, I have no voice. Why does anybody want to read? And it's like, and I did. It's hard to write a book, and I like to think that I always had a lot of compassion for the writers that we were working with, but I can tell you I have a lot more now. But I did have great moments of doubt and terror and anxiety, and I did have a moment of marching into my editor's office and saying, if I cannot get it right the next time I hand you a piece of text, I want to get out of the contract. And and he laughed at me, and he was like, honey, everything's going to be fine. You're a genius. We have great faith in you. And the next time I handed him a piece of text, he was like, you got it. You nailed it. And from that point on, I won't say that it was effortless, but it was really a matter of sit down, open up the Word file, and start typing. Mm-hmm. And it flowed. Mm-hmm. It finally flowed. The process was supposed to be a lot shorter. It took me fully 5 years to write the book before it was done, when we thought, oh, it'll be done in 1.5 years, which was, I think, crazy. What was I thinking? But I can say now, happily, that now that I have started working on my second book,
Okay.
I am not self-terrified. Like, oh yeah, I mean, it's like, I know how to do this. I know how to write. So I just sit and I write and I make notes and I stick them in, all over the place so I can find them later.
And does having written a book now, does that change the way that you do your day-to-day job, the way that you view other people's manuscripts or approach manuscripts now?
I mean, I think that it's all sort of coalesced into my doing my job, which I still have to do with a certain level of strictness, because a deadline is a deadline, whether you like it or not. But I think that I like to think that I bring a little more sort of lovingness to the process than maybe I did before. But you still have to get the books published.
Yeah. And then also I think it was off the back of the book, you've developed a game as well, Stet.
Yes, there is a game. Oh, I have it on right here. So here's Stet. There's Stet.
Excellent.
And Stet came about because one of my sibling divisions that does what we teasingly refer to them as the paper products people. But they do calendars and journals and games and all that sort of stuff. And they came to me and they said, we want to do something. We think there's something to be done, fun to be had. And in the one hand, they were thinking about a journal. On the other hand, they were thinking about a game. And we all decided that a game would be more fun. And so now there's this game, and it's 100 cards, and on the front of each card is a sort of a sample sentence, and your job playing the game is to figure out what, if anything, is wrong with what's on the front of the card, and on the back of the card is the explanation. And some of them are much more, the grammar cards are sort of straightforward. It's like something is either correct or it's incorrect. The style cards are where, and I've been hearing about this from people who play the game. The style cards are where the arguments break down, which was great, which is the whole point of it.
Absolutely.
It's not, you're not playing Monopoly. It's a game about playing with language, and it needs to be as playful as writing, as playful as copy editing, and it's fun. I had a lot of collaboration on it because, of course, these are people who make games for a living, so they knew what they wanted, and just because there was so much going on, they hired as a collaborator a writer, and so she and I suggested her, because she's a good friend of mine who's a very good copy editor and a very good writer. And so she was brought on to get it all sort of mapped out, and did an extraordinary job. And it's one of the things that, like, when you're a copy editor and you want to suggest a better sentence to a writer, you try to sound like the writer. And she, as I said, did a really good job at sounding more like me than I do sometimes. So I'm really pleased with it, and people seem to be having a lot of fun with it.
It looks good. I'm very keen to pick it up. So yeah, I will do. I think it's available in the UK now as well.
It is. It is at your local Waterstones or wherever else you want to get it.
And if this is a difficult question I'm going to throw you, but if you were to give a piece of advice to an author starting out, in terms of a piece of writing advice, an error that you see in a lot of early manuscripts or something, what would that be?
I think that the key piece of advice I would want to give to a writer is from the writer part of me, before we get to from the copy editing part of me. And the advice from the writer part of me is to try to find that mental space where you can write without constantly looking over your own shoulder while you're doing it. and it's like when I write, I mean, it's like I don't go into a trance. I don't like sit down and 3 hours go by and it's like, oh, there are 6,000 words. Who wrote those? It's like I know what I'm doing. Yeah, don't you wish? It's like I know what I'm doing when I'm doing it, and I do have a little bit of the critical part of my brain is turned on while I'm working. But if you're going to be judging and critiquing your own writing while you're doing it, you're gonna be where I was, 30 years ago when I developed that awful, what was really basically writer's block. I mean, I scared myself to death and paralyzed myself. So that's my advice as writer to writer. I don't necessarily have like, here's the magic trick to achieve that. I just know that you have to figure it out.
Yeah.
As a copy editor, I mean, the thing is, whatever sort of self-editing, self-copy editing you want to do when you're finished doing the actual writing, I mean, there are all those millions of things that the tricks that I have up my sleeve about, the grammatical blunders that everybody makes, the words that nobody knows how to spell properly, the fact that 60% of writers think that the past tense of the verb to lead is spelled L-E-A-D as opposed to L-E-P. It's like, well, there are things that people know and there are things that people don't know. And if you are in the position of wanting to go through your own writing and clean it up and clean it up and clean it up, then it really is just having 100 little tricks up your sleeve and applying them, and they're all in the book. I guess the only the real key thing is that, writers who are going to be published by a publishing house are going to go through that whole editorial, copy editorial, proofreading process. They got a whole army of people supporting them. If you don't necessarily have that, if you're being published in a venue that doesn't give you a lot of copy editorial backup, the only thing that I can truly suggest is you always want another set of eyes on your writing.
Yeah.
So find a buddy and find somebody to give your writing to, and they look at yours and you look at theirs, because somebody else is always going to see things that you would never see.
Well, it's funny. One of the techniques that you read about, and that actually I have found does work sometimes, is if you've written something on Word, say, if you then transfer it into a different font or put it on your Kindle or something like that, somehow things will jump out at you more.
Yeah, that's really true. I've definitely found that on the Kindle for sure. When you read it in different formats, somehow you're right, it does flag up things.
No, that absolutely works, and that is something that I will do when I'm writing. Also, I mean, again, putting the editorial brain on, I tend to blow things up real big, to fill my large screen so that you're almost immersed in it.
Yeah.
It's like IMAX copy editing, so that nothing can get away from you.
Yeah.
I mean, it is one of the things that can happen is that when you're being published and you've gone back and forth with your editor and your copy editor, in Times New Roman or whatever your font is, it's seeing the text designed, and laid out on a page by a designer. Really, it makes you see things fresh.
Yeah.
And for some writers, that is a new point of panic. They just suddenly it looks terrible. Other writers, you send them their page proofs, and writers, of course, have the prerogative to do whatever they want when they get their page proofs. But basically, I mean, for a lot of writers, it's like, I've seen this enough. I just want to read it, make sure it's okay, give it back to you.
Yeah.
And not rewrite it for the 30th.
Yeah. I found that reading it out loud really helps me with terms of the kind of the pace or the cadence of the sentences. It seems to help me click whether it's clunky or not. That's something that you do.
I find that when I'm copy editing, if if I'm stuck on a sentence because it doesn't feel right, it doesn't look right, and I can't figure out what it is, if I read it aloud, alone in my office, it's like I can hear what doesn't work.
Exactly.
I can hear what doesn't work. When I had the opportunity, I narrated my own audio.
Right.
And when I went in the studio to do that, from the pages that were essentially, everybody'd been through them, as many times as they were ever going to be gone through. They were done. They were ready to go to the printer, and so there I am, and I'm sitting there, and I'm reading the book aloud, and I was, as a rule, I was satisfied with what I had done. But there's a thing that I always say as a copy editor. I say in the book that a good sentence is one that, no matter how long and twisty it is, the reader can get from the beginning of the sentence to the end of the sentence without having to go back and start over again because the writers put a piece of punctuation in a place that doesn't quite work, or used a word, that can read as either a noun or a verb, and you read it the wrong way. All those little things that can go wrong. Well, but in recording the book, I found that there were a few times where I had written one of those sentences that I got lost.
Yeah.
And
was it too late by that stage, or did you?
Well, no. I mean, I would have pulled rank anyway, but there was enough time for me to go back in and fix a couple of little things that wanted fixing. I mean, it's often the case that when our own writers record their own audiobooks, which is always at the end of the process, when we think that we're finished with a book, they will find something. I mean, sometimes they find a typo that got past everybody, and God bless them for that, because it happens. But sometimes something just doesn't sit right with them, and they will ask if they can change it. And it's if we have the time, and it's not a matter of like dropping a paragraph and then having to rerun 250 pages beyond that, which beyond the pale. But little fixes, I mean, we try to be accommodating to our writers. I mean, you want the book to come out the way everybody wants it.
Absolutely.
But no, the reading aloud thing, that's really important. That's really, really, really important.
And so you said you're working on a second book. Are you able to share a bit more about that?
Yeah. When the first book came out, and I had sworn that that was it. I was done. One book. And then, of course, I'm having fun being a published writer, and it occurs to me that I might want to try it again, which, of course, made my agent very happy, and made the house happy. It was like you don't contract with an author with the idea, one book and then you can go away.
We're
going to put a lot of effort into this. Maybe we want to do it, again. In any event. But the question was, what am I going to write? And people had a few ideas that I was appalled by. How about Dreyer's English for business writing? And I was like, nah, I'd kind of rather die. And then one of my friends, an editor in another division of Penguin Random House, said, there's a thing I had done, I had never written anything so quickly. It was just a couple of paragraphs, taking the first paragraph of Shirley Jackson's novel, The Haunting of Hill House, and breaking it down into its copy editorial parts. The semicolons, the commas, the choices of adjective, the rhythm, the this, that. And I just sort of did it, and it was published, and people were highly amused by it. And my friend said, I would like to read a whole book of that. And that's what this is going to be. It's Dreyer's fiction. And I am taking a lot of examples of a lot of writing that I love and have always loved, and I'm breaking it down copy editorially to be amusing to readers who like to see what happens when you pull the curtain back. Hopefully helpful to writers who can learn that a piece of writing isn't simply, oh, that's really brilliant. It's like, yes, but why?
Yeah.
What what is Virginia Woolf doing that works so well? What is, David Mitchell doing that works so well? What can we learn from it? So I'm doing that, which means I'm doing a lot of reading and taking notes. And then I figure there will probably be some good in the trenches stories that I didn't slip into the first book that people might like. And it's going to be fun.
It
That
sounds
really
good.
interesting.
Yeah.
I like the sound of that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a blast.
Awesome.
And in another 5 years or sooner?
It's not going to be quite that long, but I am reminded that even when you are not wrestling with writer's block, if you have a full-time job, particularly one that is about immersion in reading, there's only so many hours of the day you can spend reading.
Yeah.
So I have to pace myself. Yeah. It has been the saving grace of being published by my own house, the house that I work for. That as I like to say during the long slog of getting the first book done, it's like, you know where I am all day. You know what I'm doing. But I'm picking up the pace on this one for sure.
Great. As you say, reading all day and stuff like that as part of the job, do you still find time and find enjoyment at reading for pleasure as well? Or is that difficult sometimes? For a number of reasons, one of them, of course, being that I'm now doing reading for the new book. And that has to be, It has to be done. And the thing is, this is not going to be a book about exposing writing I don't like to criticism. No.
It's like everything that I want to write about is going to be something that I like.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of that kind of reading. I have found in the last few months, since we all got locked up, that my attention span for reading is kind of limited, and I find myself, reading all day for work, reading stuff for the book. When it comes to any other sort of reading, I've only really been rereading. It's like I go back and even books that I'm not really going to write about, I'm going back and just rereading things that I like, because I don't have the I just don't have the concentration.
Yeah, no, I do
right now to take on new things, and I'm watching a lot of TV.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Would you? Has this made you want to perhaps write a fiction book of your own?
Yes, absolutely. And that of course was my counter offer when people were saying, "Well, why don't you write Dreyer's English for Business?" I was like, "Why don't I write a novel?" and I remember having a drink with my agent, whom I love, and she says, "Benjamin, whatever it is that you want to do, I will represent you." And she said, "I'm just suggesting that we are having a wonderful moment here, and we should sort of restrike while the iron is hot and build on what it is that you've done. And you are not known for your fiction. So we'll get there, but maybe let's do something, let's do something Dreyery now." And she's absolutely right. And again, going back to Susan Campbell, Susan said to me, and it was one of the last conversations actually we had, she said, "I don't want you trying to write a novel under the threat of a contract.
Mm-hmm.
You just go, and you want to play with fiction, go play with fiction for your own amusement. Sit down, write a story, write a few paragraphs, but do not embark on signing a contract to write a novel." And she's right. And when the time comes, I will sort of, go quiet, go underground, and play around. I do have a few ideas, and we'll get to that. But it's going to be a while. It's like I'm going to write Dreyer's fiction. I am then going to return to Dreyer's English, because the house thinks it's a good idea that at a certain point we put out a second edition.
Right.
So there will be a second edition of Dreyer's English, which will be, like 30 or 35% more and or different. Mm-hmm. So it won't be a retread. It'll be a lot of things I hadn't thought about, a lot of new stuff that's popped up. Eventually there will be a novel.
We've kind of covered this already, but what was the last book that you read?
Oh, what was the last book? The last book that I read, not necessarily intending to write about it, but then as I was reading it, I realized there were things in it that I did want to write about. But my intention was just to read it for fun. I reread H.G. Wells's The Time Machine.
All right.
Oh, nice. I've never read that actually myself.
Oh gosh, it is so good. And the one chapter that I really want to dig in to is toward the end, and it is one of the most eloquent depictions of absolute despair and apocalypse that I have ever read, and that's the chapter I want to write about, because it's like, we're going to figure out how he did this.
Yeah,
it's a spectacular book, and it's barely 100 pages long.
I think it does sound like quite a fun book that you're writing. Just go back to your favorite books and the scenes that excite you the most and deconstructing them. It must be quite a lot of fun. What was the last film that you watched?
The last film that I watched was a film from the mid 1960s, starring Natalie Wood and Robert Redford, called Inside Daisy Clover, which is about a young woman who becomes a sort of a teenage film star. I mean, basically, it's like she's Judy Garland, she's famous, and everybody loves her, and they exploit her, and all these things happen. And it was the thing that I had queued up from Turner Classic Movies that was the next thing to watch. The last new thing that I watched, and I intended to pace myself and instead binged on it. I watched I May Destroy You.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We just finished watching that recently, yeah.
Gosh, that's good.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, I thought it was excellent, and I struggled with it in parts, and then I kind of realized why I was struggling, and that was almost intentional. And it's such a clever, well-written piece that even when I was like, I don't really agree with what's happening, or I don't feel comfortable, or the way kind of you confront questions that you don't like to confront about the way you think about things. And it's not an enjoyable watch in a lot of places, but it's very, very good. I thought,
I was really impressed with its complexity, in that, as is the case with most good fictional writing, almost nobody in it is all good or all bad. There are times when the protagonist is absolutely unbearable.
Yeah, exactly.
There are lots of muddy issues insofar as complicity is concerned, and I found it just fascinating. And it's the funny thing about, and I don't know, maybe it's we start to watch things on TV with the idea that they're supposed to be particularly easily digestible. Mm-hmm. And then we're always a little surprised when they're not.
Yeah.
But sometimes, of course, things just sort of get off on a slightly bumpy start. I don't know if you had the HBO new Perry Mason series over there.
Yeah.
It's bumpy. The first couple of episodes is like, and then it just it puts its hooks into you and just drags you.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah, absolutely.
I had such a good time watching that too.
Excellent.
Oh yeah, so the very last part we do is either or. So there's most of them. There's no right or wrong answer. We'll let you know when there is. There's one question which I do have a pet peeve about.
I'm pretty sure you're not going to get the answer you want.
Yeah, almost certainly. Yeah. The first one: Strunk and White's The Elements of Style, or the Grammar Girl's Quick and Dirty Tips for Better Writing.
Grammar Girl.
Nice. Why is that?
A, because I like her. I mean, personally, it's like I like her. B, because she's funny. C, because she really knows her stuff. And D, because I am not one of those people who who insist on like, dragging elements of style through a trench and stepping on it. There's a lot of really good stuff in that book, but it was written a really long time.
Yeah.
And the thing that I like about Mignon is that, she's young and vibrant and opinionated, like me. and she knows her stuff.
TV or cinema?
TV. I like to watch things on my own terms and on my own time. And every now and then there is something visually spectacular enough that warrants for me going to a movie theater to get it on that great big screen experience. Yeah. But as a rule, I find myself very satisfied watching things at home.
Great. Nice. Real book or ebook?
Real book. Print book.
There you go, Tariq. I told you.
I'm afraid that was the. That's my.
Tariq's always disappointed.
The lone voices from the ebook world.
You know what? I have nothing against.
No one starts a sentence like that with "it's going to end well for ebooks."
No, I mean part of my preference simply has to do with the fact that I'm on screen all day. So when I want to read for something that is not necessarily work related, I like to have a book in my hand. I think that ebooks are wonderful. We really put a lot of effort into making them be really good for the reader. I certainly think that if I were the sort of person who was reading a lot of the sorts of things that tend to be published in those little rack-sized paperbacks, mysteries, thrillers, romance, that sort of thing, I would be all over ebooks because you can make the fonts bigger. I just like to read on paper.
Fair enough. And last one, a fancy restaurant or a takeaway?
I even before being permanently cooped up, I like takeaway just fine, and I like doing my own cooking just fine. But I love going out. I love going out. Yeah. I mean, there was a long time after I stopped working in restaurants where I couldn't be in a restaurant without being incredibly self-conscious about the entire process. But now I have, over the years, I have turned back into a normal human being. I love being waited on, and I love somebody cooking something really wonderful for me that I didn't have anything to do with, other than pointing at it on the menu and saying, "Bring me that."
Excellent. I mean, you were always going to be in a losing one there, Tariq, with the real book ebook question.
He was on the cusp. He's on the cusp. I might take it as a half point.
Yeah, you try and take all the points you can. No, he obviously sees the merit in ebooks, but yeah, I understand why he prefers real books ultimately.
He's a smart guy. He's a smart guy, Benjamin.
Yeah, thanks very much to Benjamin for taking the time to do that. Really appreciate him coming on to the podcast to talk to us. It was a lot of fun. Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to Dreyer's fiction because I think that sounds brilliant. Dissecting those scenes in these great books and seeing why they work will be really interesting. And I think
that's a really good way to learn. Just why do good scenes work well? That there's so much to learn from that. As why I was reading why scenes don't work, but I think it's quite a fun way to learn how things work. Scenes everyone enjoys reading them already, and it sounds very, very good.
And he's also a fan of Perry Mason, which I've just finished watching as well, which I really enjoyed as well.
Good, isn't it?
Yeah, very good. Yeah. Highly recommend it.
He's very good, Matthew Reese. That's
yeah.
It. Yeah, he's excellent.
No, it's if you remember the Perry Mason from the 1980s, it's very different. I think it's fair to say. Sort of modernized, but set in the 1930s or 40s. It's a really worth catching up on if you can.
Was the old Mason not set in the same time frame, was it?
I'd need to watch it again, but no, I don't think it was. I think it was set in the 80s. I think it was.
Oh, right. Yeah. They have changed. It's like a more LA Confidential feel.
Yeah.
It's very good, though. It's excellent.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. So if you've not got your copies of Dreyer's English, I would highly recommend picking that one up. And also, Stet sounds like a great game if you're into that sort of thing. So
give that a go.
A good Christmas game, I would say, assuming we're allowed to speak to other human beings at Christmas. It sounds great. So thanks very much to Benjamin for coming on again, and we look forward to Dreyer's fiction, as we say. We've got another great guest next week for our 50th episode, Tariq.
The big one. We do indeed. Next week we are chatting with Peng Shepherd, who her first book, The Book of M, came out last year, and her second book, The Cartographers, is due out very shortly. Yeah,
I think it's due out next summer. But we talked to her about both books, and The Book of M, if you've not checked it out, I would highly recommend. It's a sort of speculative. Would you say apocalyptic? It's that kind of dystopian thing, isn't it?
But it's not something like The Walking Dead.
No.
It's more Station 11, that kind of literary,
exactly.
speculative, as you say, that kind of really well written apocalyptic fiction
about people's shadows disappearing. Which is it's a really high concept, brilliant idea, I think.
It reminded me a lot of The Leftovers.
And she also had a really interesting route to publishing, quite a quick route to publishing, it has to be said. But it's a really great episode with Peng, so hope you tune in for that one. As ever, if you enjoyed the episode, I would ask that you take a couple of seconds to give us a rating on your podcast app, Apple Podcasts or whatever it is you use. That we'd really appreciate it. It helps us climb the rankings, especially if you're able to leave a quick review as well. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well, so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.